A schoolyard is supposed to remember chalk, not rifle fire. But in Iquique, Chile, a fight over 18 pence ended with workers, mothers, and children trapped beside a school wall while the state decided whether they were citizens or targets. So, how did a place of shelter become a killing ground? I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore, from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. A schoolyard is supposed to remember chalk on small fingers, the scrape of desks, the bell that releases children back into the sun. In Iquique, one schoolyard remembered the sound of rifle fire. That is the question that keeps this story alive more than a century later. How does a government turn a place of shelter into a trap? And how does a nation spend the next 100 years arguing with the dead? In northern Chile, the answer began in the desert, but it ended beside a school wall. To understand Santa Maria, you have to walk into the nitrate world slowly, with the wind in your face and dust in your teeth. Tarapacá was not just a province on a map. It was a machine for turning white mineral into wealth. Ships left loaded with nitrate. Fortunes were made in offices far from the pampas. But the men who cut that wealth from the earth lived under another law entirely, one written in debt, distance, hunger, and the company whistle. Life in the nitrate fields was a hard bargain even before the first shot. Workers faced unstable wages, dangerous conditions, company stores that could swallow a family's pay before the week was done, and token systems that tied people to the bosses who already owned the road, the scales, the store, and the clock. In theory, a man was paid for labor. In practice, he was kept inside an entire little kingdom of dependency, where even survival had to be bought back from the company. And this mattered because the desert was already learning the language of protest. Across Chile, the first years of the century had shown workers a harsh truth. In Valparaiso, in Santiago, in Antofagasta, labor conflict had already drawn blood. The Republic liked to speak the language of order and progress, but when poor people gathered in numbers and demanded dignity, the answer often arrived wearing boots. Santa Maria did not fall from a clear sky. It came after several warnings, and every warning had already smelled of powder. By the time the year 1907 reached December, the air was already electric. Around December 9th and 10th, the strike in the nitrate zone broke open in San Lorenzo and spread through Alto San Antonio and other nitrate works of the desert plain. What began as one labor stoppage quickly became a regional pulse. Men left the works, committees formed, demands were drafted, and the road to Iquique began to fill with bodies, banners, rumors, and the stubborn idea that this time, together, they might finally be heard. People later remembered the conflict by the phrase that stuck in their ears as a coin dropped on wood, the 18-pence strike. That was not poetry. It was arithmetic, and arithmetic can be brutal. The workers demanded that their wages be paid at a fixed exchange of 18 pence, because the peso had fallen so badly that pay was dissolving in their hands. They also demanded fair exchange for company tokens, honest weights and measures in the stores, and an end to tricks that let employers squeeze labor twice. Notice what that means. This was not some vague uprising born out of chaos. The workers came with a list. They knew where the theft had happened. They knew how the bosses shaved value off a week's labor. They knew how a man could be paid in one currency and forced to live in another. The desert had taught them to count every crumb, every coin, every lie. That is why the movement spread so fast. Everyone already knew the numbers. Everyone already knew the trap. But there was something else in that march toward Iquique, something more dangerous than anger. There was organization, mutual aid societies, labor circles, democratic clubs, socialists, anarchists, and plain workers who had had enough all fed the same current. These were not men wandering unquestioningly toward a city. They were people learning in real time what collective presence could do. A man alone in the pampa could be starved, cheated, or dismissed. Thousands walking together into the port became a political fact that nobody could ignore, and they did not come alone. Wives came, children came, families came wrapped in blankets, in fear and in hope. That detail matters more than any speech by a minister. People do not usually bring children to a battlefield they know is waiting. They bring children when they expect pressure, pleading, maybe beatings, maybe arrests, but not a slaughter pen. The presence of women and children is one of the clearest signs of what the strikers believed they were entering and what the state later chose to make of it. The gathering in Iquique was also larger than one nationality. Chileans stood there, yes, but so did many Peruvians and Bolivians who worked the same nitrate world and breathed the same debt poison. The desert economy had pulled them all into the same machine, and by December it had pushed them into the same danger. Later accounts remember something crucial. When authorities and consuls offered some foreign workers a chance to leave before the assault, most refused to save themselves apart from their Chilean companions. They chose solidarity over survival. As more columns came down from the pampas, Iquique changed color. The port, used to trade and traffic, now had the desert camped inside it, public spaces filled with strikers. Plaza Manuel Montt swelled with men, women, and children. The Santa Maria school became one of the main shelters. Estimates varied, as they always do in moments like this, but the crowd had grown into the many thousands. Elites, merchants, employers, and officials watched the city being transformed by labor's physical presence and read the scene as a threat. That is where Carlos Eastman enters the story in full. He was the intendant of Tarapacá, the state's face in the province, and many workers still believed he might broker a solution. When Eastman appeared before the crowd, hope flared. He was welcomed because the people wanted to believe the government had finally come to listen, but private words mattered more than public applause. In meetings with strike leaders, Eastman made clear that the laborers were expected to return to work first. Justice would come later, maybe. The workers had heard that song before. The employers were no longer generous. Evidence left behind shows that some were privately willing to satisfy parts of the demands, but not while thousands of workers stood together in public forcing the issue. To concede under pressure would set a precedent, and precedent can terrify the powerful more than hunger terrifies the poor. The strikers understood that if they returned to the nitrate fields without guarantees, the promises would evaporate the moment the crowd dissolved. So both sides waited, and while they waited, the room for mercy got smaller. Then the Republic's military weight came into play. Troops were sent, the cruiser Centeno came north. Roberto Silva Renard arrived with the authority of command and the cold confidence of a man sent to restore obedience. There were already signs of what that would mean. On December 20th, at Buenaventura, soldiers fired on strikers, killing and wounding workers who were trying to move their families. That should have been the last warning. Instead, it became the opening of the final act. That same day, restrictions tightened around Iquique like a knot. Eastman imposed limits on movement and assembly. The workers were ordered to concentrate in and around the Santa Maria School and Plaza Montt. Think about the cruelty hidden inside that decision. What appeared to be administrative control also created a trap. A schoolyard is a place where people cluster naturally, where families try to stay together, where tired bodies can rest against walls and trust the shape of shelter. By nightfall, that place of refuge had already become a box. Imagine the evening before the massacre. Cooking fires are burning low. Children are finally sleeping after days of marching and confusion. Men are discussing rumors in tight circles. Mothers keep one ear open to every bootstep in the dark. Some still believe that dawn would bring negotiation. Others felt the city changing around them, felt the tension in the streets, the silent weight of rifles waiting just beyond the square. A schoolyard is eerie when it holds too much silence. It means people are not resting, they are listening for whatever comes next. And before the fatal hour arrived, another terrible line was drawn. Workers from different backgrounds with different accents and papers stayed together. Many Peruvians and Bolivians were given a chance to separate themselves from what was coming. Most did not take it. They remained with the larger crowd, with their fellow laborers, because the desert had already taught them a truth stronger than nationality. The company paid all of them badly. The state would shoot all of them the same. And betrayal often begins by asking you to save only yourself. By the afternoon of December 21st, the geometry of death was in place. Silva Renard wanted the workers out. Orders were given for the crowd to leave and head away under military instruction toward the lines that would carry them back to the Pampa and back under employer power. The strike leaders refused to dissolve the movement without real guarantees. That refusal is the hinge of the story. One side saw survival and dignity, the other side saw disobedience. Between those two visions stood a packed schoolyard full of families. Pause there because this is where history often lies to itself later. The massacre was not some sudden confusion between equal forces. The crowd gathered at Santa Maria was dense, exposed, and largely unarmed. It was not positioned like an army. It was positioned like human beings waiting in the wrong place while power decided whether they were citizens or targets. Once troops ring a space like that, walls stop being protection. They become barriers. Open ground stops being public space. It becomes a field of fire. Then came the order. Silva Renard commanded his troops to shoot into the crowd, not over their heads, not into the air as a warning, into the people. The first volley in a massacre does something beyond tearing flesh. It shatters expectations. In 1 second, an argument becomes terror. A father turns to shield a child. A woman looks for a doorway that is suddenly too far away. A body nearby folds in a way the eye cannot understand at first. The mind resists what the rifles have already decided. Witnesses described repeated volleys, not one brief crack, swallowed by silence. The soldiers fired into human density, and density itself became the executioner's ally. Those in front fell onto those behind them. Those in back could not see clearly enough to know where safety lay. Panic jammed every possible exit. The schoolyard became a machine of compression, cries, dust, splintered wood, and blood. A civic place turned into a killing ground in seconds. And it did so because the state chose to make an example of where families had gathered. The horror was not limited to where the first bullets landed. Once the crowd broke, fear ran in every direction, and the rifles followed. People were hit, trying to flee, trying to duck into corners, trying to drag the wounded, trying to carry children through openings that were suddenly too narrow for panic. In massacres like this, movement does not guarantee survival. Sometimes it simply redraws the map of death, from the center of the square to the edge of the street, from the school doorway to the place where someone almost escaped. This is why the schoolyard matters so much. A school carries a promise, even when nobody says it aloud. It says that children belong here. It says that tomorrow is still being prepared. It says that gathering here should not end in slaughter. In Iquique, that promise was turned inside out. The walls of the Santa Maria school did not protect the people pressed against them. They framed the betrayal. That is part of why the massacre never loosened its grip on memory. The setting itself became an accusation. When the firing ended, the dead were not all counted, not all named, not all mourned properly. Bodies lay in the square. The wounded filled hospitals, and many of them died later that same night. Survivors were not gathered into comfort. They were brought under military control, then sent back toward the nitrate works or shipped away under armed supervision. Even the aftermath obeyed the same brutal logic as the shooting. Break the body, scatter the witnesses, thin the record, restore order before grief has time to organize itself into speech. And here we have to speak carefully, because honesty matters more than drama. The exact number of people killed at Santa Maria is still disputed. Official counts were low. Worker memory and many later accounts push the number far higher. Some estimates live in the hundreds. Others rise above 1,000, even toward 2,000 or more. The safest truth is also the most chilling. The full total was never securely preserved, but the massacre itself is beyond dispute. The archive was wounded along with the people. What cannot be denied is the method. Chilean troops, under state command, fired sustained rifle volleys into a concentrated crowd of striking workers and their families. People died in the school area, in the plaza, and while running. That is the solid ground. Around it, numbers blur because power had every reason to minimize the dead, and the poor rarely get the luxury of careful bookkeeping when they are being buried in haste. Santa Maria survives in history with uncertain arithmetic but unmistakable guilt. The survivors carried that guilt back to the pampas. Imagine returning to the nitrate fields after watching a schoolyard become a slaughter ground. Imagine climbing again into the same labor routine, only now with the knowledge that the state had answered your demands not with reform but with rifle fire. That return was part of the massacre, too. Terror does not end when the last shot stops. It continues in the silence after, in the men who no longer trust assemblies, in the children who remember screams every time they hear boots. For many workers, Santa Maria burned away one illusion above all others, the fantasy that the state stood somewhere in the middle, balancing labor and capital like an honest referee. After Iquique, that mask became harder to believe. Employers had refused to bend. Officials had tightened the cordon. Soldiers had fired. The lesson was cruel but clear. In the nitrate north, wealth and authority were not rivals. They were partners. That insight did not automatically produce victory, but it deepened class consciousness with the speed and pain of a wound. And still, the story was not finished. History, in Latin America, has a habit of leaving knives buried in the future. 7 years later, on December 14th, 1914, a Spanish worker named Antonio Ramon attacked Silva Renard near Parque Cusino in Santiago, stabbing him in revenge for his half-brother Manuel Vaca, who had been killed in the massacre. Silva Renard survived, badly wounded. Even there, noticed the shape of memory. The state had tried to close the account with gunfire. The dead sent back a messenger carrying steel. But revenge, however dramatic, was never the whole afterlife of Santa Maria. the deeper battle happened in memory. Almost immediately, workers began turning the massacre into a date, a ritual, a wound that would not be allowed to vanish quietly. Anniversaries were observed. Newspapers of the labor movement named the dead as martyrs. The city that had watched the crowd assemble now had to watch grieving people return year after year to speak the names that power preferred to dissolve into statistics. The street had started remembering for itself. This matters because governments are not the only ones who build history. Workers build it too, sometimes with monuments, sometimes with songs, sometimes only by repeating a story often enough that their children can inherit it like a scar. Santa Maria entered popular memory, not as an abstract policy dispute, but as a scene of betrayal. The image stayed simple and unforgettable. Laborers came asking for dignity, wives and children at their side, and the Republic answered with bullets beside a school. Simplicity, when it carries blood, can outlive libraries. The story also lived in print and in political speech. Luis Emilio Recabarren and other labor voices helped turn the massacre into a moral boundary line. Before Santa Maria, exploitation could still be discussed in the dry language of wages and contracts. After Santa Maria, it was also discussed through mourning. A wage dispute had become a national crime scene. The dead did not remain only victims. They became evidence, proof that the social question in Chile was written not only in poverty, but in state violence. Decades passed, and still the memory kept changing form. Then, in the late 1960s, the massacre found another body to inhabit: music. Luis Advis, moved by the story after traveling through Iquique and working in the theater, shaped the material into what would become the Cantata Popular Santa Maria de Iquique. With Quilapayún, the old schoolyard entered another register entirely. It could now travel in melody, in narration, in drums and strings. What rifles had tried to localize in one plaza became something the whole country could sing. When the cantata was performed in 1970, Santa Maria ceased to be the exclusive domain of witnesses, historians, and worker commemorations. It entered the bloodstream of popular culture. That was no small thing. A massacre hidden in official caution becomes harder to bury once people can hum it on the way home. Song gave the dead portability. It carried the north into the south, the pampa into the city, the schoolyard into the throat. Even people who had never seen Iquique began to feel they had walked through that square. And that is one of the reasons Santa Maria never stayed safe in the past. Every generation found a new way to meet it. Some met it through family stories, some through labor politics, some through literature, some through the cantata's final ache. Others encountered it during the centenary, when the Chilean state itself had to bow its head in public. In 2007, President Michelle Bachelet agreed to a national day of mourning for the 100 years of the massacre. Flags were lowered. The nation was told to remember. A year later, the Republic went even further, at least on paper. In 2008, a law authorized the construction of 3 monuments in memory of the victims, one in Iquique, one in Santiago, and one in Valparaiso. That detail may sound cold compared with the schoolyard and the gunfire, but it matters. It means the argument over Santa Maria had climbed all the way into the architecture of the state. The same nation that once tried to reduce the dead now had to carve space for them in its official landscape. Still, memorials are never the end of a struggle like this. They can honor the victims, but they can also tidy them up, make them ceremonial, easy to salute, and easier to forget once the flowers are gone. Santa Maria has always resisted that neatness. Its story keeps reopening because it is not only about the past, it is about a pattern the continent knows too well. Labor creates wealth, power calls itself order, and when people with low incomes gather visibly enough, someone reaches for the guns. That is why Santa Maria de Iquique matters far beyond Chile. The names are Chilean, the square is Chilean, the school is Chilean, but the script of the tragedy is painfully familiar across Latin America. A booming economy dazzles the world. Workers live in another reality below the export numbers. They ask for the minimum needed to keep a household alive. The powerful call it unrest, danger, excess. Then a public space becomes a lesson. The story repeats because the structure repeats. Look closely, and the whole conflict sharpens at once. 18 pence was not merely an exchange rate. It was the fight over whether labor would reach the family table intact or vanish in tricks and devaluation. The multinational crowd mattered for the same reason. Chileans, Peruvians, and Bolivians stood together because exploitation had already made them neighbors in suffering. Eastman tightened the cordon, Silva Renard pulled the trigger, and the schoolyard became the place where class, nation, and state violence collided in full daylight. That is why the schoolyard keeps defeating abstraction. Say labor conflict, and some listeners drift away. Say state repression, and the phrase can sound too clean. But say a school full of workers' families was turned into a trap and then torn apart by rifle fire, and the body understands before the mind finishes the sentence. Santa Maria drags history back into the nerves. It reminds us that a modern republic can speak of order, progress, and law while standing over a public square of blood. And now we return to the opening image because the story has been trying to drag us back there all along. A schoolyard should be a rehearsal space for the future. In Iquique, it became a graveyard of broken promises. Workers arrived believing that numbers, demands, and collective pressure might win them a hearing. Children arrived because their parents still believed public life had limits. Santa Maria is what happened when that faith met the rifle, and the street has been arguing with the echo ever since. That is why the dead of Iquique still ask a question of the living. Not only what happened there, but what kind of nation permits such a thing, then spends generations trying to decide how much of it to admit. Was it an aberration, a panic, an excess, a crime, a warning, a founding wound? Chile is answered in many voices. The workers answered with mourning, the powerful answered with minimization. Later generations answered with song, monuments, books, and lowered flags. The argument continues because the ground itself never fully accepted the lie. So remember the schoolyard. Remember the chalk that should have been there, the children who should have been safe there, the adults who believed a public place still belonged to them. Remember the 18 pence that sounds small until you realize whole families were marching behind it. Remember Eastman's promises, Silva Reynard's order, the Peruvians and Bolivians who stayed, the knife of Antonio Ramon years later, and the song that refused to let the dead go mute. The street remembers, the desert remembers. What does your country still refuse to forget? Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.